A poor girl holds a faded photo and asks the young billionaire, "Do you know him? My mom said he was my dad." Upon seeing the photo, he is stunned. It was 6:30 when Miles Turner finally left the glass-fronted building downtown. The sky was already darkening and streetlights were beginning to flicker on one by one. Another day that ended far too late. His body begged for rest, but his mind still raced with numbers, deadlines, and unresolved problems. Miles loosened his tie and took a deep breath. The evening air, even with the smell of asphalt and restaurant food, felt cleaner than the office air. He gripped the handle of his leather briefcase more tightly and started walking toward the parking lot. 12 hours inside that office, and only now did he notice how tight his shoes felt. People hurried by, anonymous faces mirroring the same fatigue he carried. Some were on their phones, others stared fixedly at the ground, most avoided eye contact, the unwritten rule of big cities. It was in that moment, amid the automatic steps of someone who walks the same route every day, that Miles noticed something different. A small figure stood out in the crowd, a child of only 5, standing on the sidewalk alone, looking around with an expression that mixed curiosity and determination. It wasn't common to see someone so young by themselves in that commercial area, especially at that hour. Miles instinctively slowed his pace. The little girl wore a simple blue dress and had brown hair in a messy braid. She didn't look lost or scared, just resolute, as if she were looking for someone specific in the flow of people. He was about to keep walking when he realized the girl's eyes were now fixed on him. For a second, Miles glanced around, thinking maybe she was looking at someone else, but there was no mistake. She was watching him directly and, without hesitation, began walking in his direction. "Hey, mister," she called out in a thin but firm voice. Miles stopped, unsure of what to do. People flowed around the small figure without paying her any attention, like water diverting around a stone in the middle of a river. "Me?" he asked, feeling somewhat foolish for such an obvious question. "Yeah, you," the girl replied, now just a few steps away. "Can I ask you something?" Miles looked around, searching for any adult who might be with her. "Are you alone? Where are your parents?" "My mum's working over there," she said, pointing vaguely to a store across the street. "She said I could wait outside, but then I saw you passing by." Miles frowned, not understanding. "You saw me passing by, but we don't know each other." The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the small, colorful backpack she was carrying and took something out. It was a photograph, not one of today's sleek, glossy prints, but an old, worn picture with faded color. "Do you know him?" she asked, holding out the photo to Miles. "My mum said he was my dad." Her tone was so direct, so simple, that Miles took the photo automatically. But as he looked at the image, he felt as though the ground vanished from beneath his feet. The face staring back at him in the photo wasn't a stranger. It was Jonah Turner, his brother. The noise of the street seemed to vanish for an instant. Miles felt his pulse quicken and his mouth go dry. Those same green eyes, the same crooked smile, the dark, unruly hair that never stayed in place, a face he hadn't seen in 7 years, since that last fight, since the harsh words they'd exchanged, since Jonah slammed the door and disappeared from his life. "Mister, are you okay?" The child's voice pulled him back to reality. Miles looked at her now with a different perspective. He noticed details he hadn't seen before. The shape of her little chin, small but determined. The curve of her eyebrows. The way her eyes narrowed slightly when she asked a question. Traces of Jonah, in a miniature feminine version. What's your name?" Miles asked, his voice almost failing him. "Sophie," she answered simply. "Sophie Lewis, and you?" Miles swallowed hard before replying, Miles Turner." The girl's eyes widened a bit upon hearing the last name. "Turner? Like my dad?" "Yes," Miles confirmed, still holding the photo, unable to look away from her. "Jonah he's my brother." Sophie took a step forward, her face lighting up with a mix of surprise and delight. "So you're my dad's brother," she exclaimed, as if she'd just discovered a treasure. "My mom never told me my dad had a brother." Miles couldn't respond right away. The reality of what was happening began to form in his mind, piece by piece. Jonah had a daughter. A daughter he'd never mentioned. A daughter who didn't know him. And now, by some inexplicable twist of fate, she was here, in front of him, calling him uncle. "Sophie, where exactly is your mom right now?" Miles asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "At the clothing store," she said again, pointing to the other side of the street. "She's finishing work. I always wait for her on the bench, but today..." She looked at the photo Miles still held. "I thought you looked like someone who might know him." Miles felt a chill run down his spine. A child no older than 5 had approached him on the street, alone, because she thought he looked like someone who might know her dad. It was crazy, or destiny. "I think we need to talk to your mum," Miles said, looking toward the store Sophie had indicated. "She might be worried about you." "No, she knows I'm here," Sophie insisted, then added, "But we can go there if you want to meet her. And she'll want to meet you too once I tell her you're my dad's brother." There was so much enthusiasm, so much innocence in her voice, that Miles couldn't bring himself to refuse. Besides, he needed to understand what was going on. Jonah had a daughter, a family he'd never mentioned. "All right, let's go," he agreed, handing the photo back to Sophie, who put it carefully away in her backpack. As they crossed the street, Miles tried to organize his thoughts, but they spun like a runaway carousel. The last time he'd seen Jonah, his brother was storming out of their parents' house after yet another argument about his life choices. Jonah had always been the rebel, the dreamer, the one who rejected the safe path their family had set out. Miles, on the other hand, had followed every plan to the letter. College, stable career, financial success. Their arguments had grown more bitter over time, until one particularly tense night, words were spoken that couldn't be taken back. Jonah said he'd rather disappear than live under the family's stifling expectations. Miles responded that maybe it would be for the best, and Jonah did exactly as he'd promised. He vanished. For years, Miles tried to find him. At first, out of guilt and concern. Then, when his brother's silence proved deliberate, pride took over, and Miles stopped looking. Now, walking beside this child who called his brother Dad, he felt a wave of remorse so powerful it nearly stopped him in the middle of the street. The store was small, specializing in women's clothing. A door chime sounded when Miles and Sophie entered. The interior was cramped, with racks of colorful dresses and a few mannequins in the window. Behind the counter, a young woman was finishing up with a customer. After a brief conversation, Miles accepted Sophie's invitation to see her home. He accompanied her to an old building not far away. As they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Miles felt his heart pounding harder with each step. What would he say to the girl's mother? How would he explain his sudden appearance? Sophie opened the door to a small but tidy apartment and ran inside. "Mom, I'm back, and I brought someone with me." A young woman appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her welcoming smile froze when she spotted the stranger standing at the door. "Sophie, what? Who is..." Her hesitant words died when her eyes met Miles's. "He's my dad's brother, Mom," Sophie explained excitedly. "He saw the photo and confirmed it." The woman went pale, looking from Sophie to Miles with an expression that combined shock and distrust. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Miles said, feeling uncomfortable under her gaze. "I'm Miles Turner." Sophie approached me on the street and showed me a photo of Jonah, and I couldn't just walk away after that. "You're really his brother?" the woman asked, her voice trembling slightly as she came closer, studying his face carefully for any resemblance that might confirm her daughter's claim. "My name is Grace Lewis," she introduced herself formally, though the stiffness in her posture showed how tense she really was. "And yes, Jonah Turner is my daughter's father, but in all the time we spent together, he never once mentioned having a brother." Miles felt the weight of those words. Jonah hadn't just left him behind. "And we haven't spoken in a long time," he explained, not sure where to begin. "There was a fight, things that shouldn't have been said, and he simply walked out of my life. Out of the family's life, actually." Grace seemed to be assessing him, measuring his sincerity. "Sophie, honey," she said, kneeling down to the child's level. "Could you go play in your room while I talk to Mr. Miles for a moment?" Sophie hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and hear more about her father's brother, but she eventually nodded and headed toward a small hallway. Grace waited until they heard the bedroom door close, before motioning to an old sofa in the tiny living room. "Jonah never talked about his family," she said in a low voice so Sophie wouldn't hear. "I knew he had living parents, but he never wanted to go into details. He said it was complicated and that he preferred to leave the past where it belonged." Miles nodded, feeling a stab of sadness. It sounded exactly like something Jonah would say. "I tried to find him for years," he confessed, "at first because I felt guilty and worried. Then, when his silence seemed intentional, my pride got in the way, and I stopped looking. I never imagined he had." He glanced at Sophie, absorbed in her drawings, "that he had a family." Grace followed his gaze and a sad smile crossed her lips. "We met 6 years ago. Sophie's 5. Jonah was—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Jonah was a man full of dreams but hard to decipher sometimes. Some days he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now I realize part of that weight was you, the family he left behind." Miles felt a lump in his throat. That was a version of Jonah he knew well, the eternally restless one, who never fit in. Yet looking at Sophie, he realized Jonah had found something real, something that seemed to give his life purpose. "Grace," Miles said, hesitant, "where is Jonah now? Why does Sophie act like she doesn't know him?" Grace's expression hardened, and she looked away. "Jonah left 2 years ago to look for a job. He said he was finally going to find something stable, that he wanted to provide a better life for Sophie. And then he never came back." Her voice wavered slightly. "No call, no letter. He just vanished. At first, I thought something terrible had happened. I looked into hospitals, even checked with the police, but there was nothing. It was as if he disappeared into thin air." Miles felt his blood run cold. It made no sense. Jonah might have had issues and been impulsive, but abandon his child, his family. "Do you really think that he abandoned you?" Miles asked, unable to hide his disbelief. Grace shrugged, a gesture that tried to seem indifferent but failed. "At first, no. I was sure something serious had happened, but then months passed and nothing, not a single clue. Then you start to wonder, to doubt." She took a deep breath, as if trying to control herself. "Sophie was only 3 when he disappeared. She barely remembers him now. All she has are photos and the stories I tell her." Miles glanced again at the little girl. Sophie hummed softly as she drew, oblivious to the gravity of the adult's conversation. A child growing up without a father, thinking he had walked away from her. "Something's off," Miles said with conviction. "The Jonah I knew would never do that. No matter how complicated things got, no matter his troubles, he would never abandon his child." Grace gave a humorless laugh. "Maybe you didn't know him as well as you think. People change, Mr. Turner. 7 years is a long time." "Miles, please. And yes, people change, but some things are fundamental. Jonah always had issues with authority, expectations, rules, but he never ever turned his back on those who truly mattered." A flicker of doubt crossed Grace's face. She seemed like she wanted to believe him but was afraid to be disappointed again. "So what are you suggesting?" Miles looked her straight in the eye. "That something happened to my brother, something that kept him from coming back to you, and I want to help figure out what." Grace blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. Then she looked at Sophie, lost in her world of drawings and colors. "Why?" she finally asked, turning back to Miles. "Why do you care after all this time?" The question struck him like a blow, because it was fair. Why care now? Because he'd just discovered he had a niece. Because the guilt for losing his brother had never fully gone away. "Because he's my brother," he replied simply. "And because she," he pointed at Sophie, "deserves to know the truth, whatever it may be." Grace studied his face for a long moment before nodding. The bedroom door opened, and Sophie appeared in the hallway, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Are you done talking?" she asked, walking toward them cautiously. Miles watched the little girl with her brown hair and curious eyes, so much like Jonah's. In that moment, he knew he couldn't back out. There was an unspoken promise being made right then, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. Sophie approached Miles even more, studying him with the direct gaze so typical of children. "Are you going to help us find my dad?" she asked simply. Grace shot her daughter a reproachful look, but the question was already out. Miles felt the weight of those simple words. "I'll do my best," he answered sincerely. Grace hesitated, looking from Sophie to Miles. Miles felt the gravity of it all. Time. The time he never spent on his brother. The time Jonah had missed with his daughter. The time they might still be able to salvage. "I want to help," Miles said, with more certainty than he'd felt in a long time. "If you'll let me." Grace paused as if weighing every possibility, every risk of trusting this man who had suddenly appeared in their lives. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. Sophie smiled, not fully understanding the seriousness of the situation, but happy about this new connection emerging. Miles picked up his leather briefcase, which he'd set on the floor upon entering, and stood. He looked around the small apartment, silent witness to the life his brother had built and then apparently abandoned. "I'll leave my card with my number," he said, taking it from the inside pocket of his blazer. "Please call me if you need anything or if you remember any detail that might help." As he headed for the door, Sophie watched quietly, her eyes following his every move. Grace approached and placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders, a gesture both protective and reassuring. Out in the hallway, Miles paused, taking a deep breath. Night had fully fallen. Through the corridor window, the streetlights reflected off the damp asphalt, creating puddles of light in the darkness. Miles looked at the starless sky, feeling the weight of the responsibility he'd just assumed. He would find Jonah. He would discover the truth. It was a silent promise made to Sophie, to Grace, to himself, and above all to the brother he'd lost so long ago. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:47 a.m. Miles turned over in bed for what felt like the 1,000th time, unable to sleep. The white ceiling of the bedroom seemed like a screen onto which images of the day were endlessly projected. Sophie. A 5-year-old girl with the same green eyes as Jonah, the same stubborn chin. A child growing up without a father, a child he hadn't even known existed until a few hours ago. Miles got up and went to the window. The city lights shimmered outside, points of brightness piercing the darkness. How many stories like his were happening at that very moment? How many separated families, estranged siblings, children growing up without knowing parts of their own stories? He went into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. In the apartment's silence, every thought, every memory was amplified. Jonah had a daughter. Jonah had made a family. Then, supposedly, he'd left it all behind. It made no sense. Not for the Jonah Miles knew. He sat on the living room sofa, letting his mind wander back 7 years, to the last time he'd seen his brother. It was one of those family gatherings where the air felt thick with unspoken expectations. Their parents had always had very clear plans for both sons, a prestigious college, a stable career, an appropriate marriage, grandchildren. Miles had followed the script to the letter. Jonah, however, was always the rebel, the questioner, the one who didn't fit the mold. That night, the argument started over something trivial, a question about the future, a comment on responsibility. But it escalated quickly, as if each word was fuel for a long-prepared fire. "Are you ever going to grow up, Jonah?" His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Will you ever take real responsibility?" "What is your problem?" Jonah yelled back, his voice raised. "Why can't you just accept that I want to live my life my own way?" Miles remembered siding with their parents, as always. The good son, the model child, the one who understood the family's concerns. "It's not about your way, Jonah," he intervened. "It's about maturity, about understanding that there are expectations." The look Jonah gave him then, a look of betrayal, of deep disappointment. "Expectations?" Jonah laughed, a mirthless sound. "You call them expectations. I call it a prison. You think you know what's best for me, but you never stop to ask what I want, what makes me happy." "And what makes you happy? Living aimlessly, without plans?" Miles shot back, It makes me happy not to have to answer for my choices. It makes me happy to breathe without feeling like I'm letting everyone down just by being myself. Miles hadn't understood back then. He couldn't grasp the weight Jonah carried. Maybe it's best if you leave then, he'd said, words he should never have uttered. If it's so hard to be here, maybe you should just go your own way. And Jonah did exactly that. He walked out the door that night and never returned. No calls, no messages, no address left behind. He vanished like smoke. Miles rubbed his face with his hands, returning to the present. Now he understood, at least partially. Jonah had found his own path. He'd met Grace, had Sophie. He'd built a life far from the suffocating expectations of the family, but to abandon that life, abandon his child, that didn't line up with the brother he knew. As rebellious and impulsive as Jonah was, he had principles. He had a heart. Miles got up and went to his office. He opened a desk drawer and took out an old photo album. On the first pages, 2 smiling boys, one on each side of a sandcastle. In the next, the same boys, older, giving each other an awkward teenage hug. Then fewer and fewer pictures of them together, as their paths gradually diverged. He ran his finger over one of the last pictures of Jonah, the crooked smile, the green eyes he now saw reflected in Sophie's. He had failed him. As the older brother, he'd chosen judgment instead of understanding. Now, 7 years later, life was giving him a second chance. A chance to find Jonah, to understand what really happened, to fix past mistakes. He closed the album with determination. It wouldn't be easy. 2 years had passed with no leads, no news, but he had resources, he had contacts, and, more importantly, he had a reason not to give up. For the first time in years, Miles felt a true sense of purpose. He would find Jonah, not just for Sophie or Grace, but for himself. To have the chance to say what he'd never said, that he was sorry, that he didn't know how to be the brother Jonah needed, that he loved him, despite everything. When morning light began to fill the apartment with a soft glow, Miles was already on the phone, the first of many calls he would make. The first step in a journey of redemption. He would find out what happened to Jonah, and in the process maybe discover something about himself as well. In the office of Turner Investments, Miles was looking out at the city through a panoramic window while talking on the phone. This would be his 5th call of the morning, yet another conversation with a contact who might help him find Jonah. "I understand your concern about privacy, Carly, but we're not talking about a stranger. He's my brother," Miles explained, gripping the phone tightly. "I just need to confirm whether he appeared in any emergency records over the past 2 years." On the other end of the line, Carl Henderson, director of one of the largest hospitals in the area, hesitated. Carl and Miles had known each other for years, ever since Miles's company became a major donor to the institution. "You know that information is confidential, Miles, even for benefactors like you. I'm not asking for medical records. I just want to know if he was admitted at any point." Miles paused. "Please, Carl. He has a daughter, a 5-year-old who hasn't seen her father for 2 years. Silence lasted a few seconds before Carl sighed in response. "I can check our system, but only if there was some record of him coming in. Nothing more, and I'll do it personally without involving the staff. Thank you. I'll send over a photo and all the details I have on him." After hanging up, Miles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been a week since Sophie approached him on the street. A week of sleepless nights and days split between work and searching for his brother. On his computer screen, a meticulously organized spreadsheet listed everything Miles had done so far. Calls to hospitals, visits to police stations, contact with social services, inquiries at homeless shelters. The list grew daily, as did the frustration of finding nothing concrete. His assistant, Richard, knocked before entering. "The reports from the meeting with the Chinese investors are ready for review," he announced, placing a folder on the desk. He hesitated before adding, "And Detective Ramirez called. He has some preliminary information on your brother." Miles glanced at the clock. He had an important meeting in 20 minutes he couldn't cancel. "Set up a meeting with Ramirez for the end of the day. And Richard?" "Yes. Thank you for handling these matters discreetly. I know it's not really part of your job." Richard nodded and left. Miles picked up his phone and saw 2 unread messages from Grace. Sophie asked if you found anything. What should I tell her? The second sent an hour later. Sorry to insist. She's anxious. Miles felt a pang in his chest. He didn't want to create false hope, but he also didn't want to leave them hanging. He typed a quick response. Nothing concrete yet, but I'm following some leads. Can I drop by tonight to talk? Her reply came almost immediately. Sure, Sophie will be glad. Thank you for everything you're doing. Miles put his phone away and tried to focus on the upcoming meeting. The last few days had turned his methodical, organized routine into something entirely different. Now, between analyzing investments and meeting with clients, he was searching for answers about a brother he hadn't seen in 7 years, a brother who, apparently, had chosen to vanish from his life, but whom Miles suspected would never have chosen to vanish from his own daughter's life. At 6 that evening, Miles met Detective Ramirez in a discreet cafe a few blocks from his office. Ramirez was a middle-aged man with watchful eyes that seemed to catch every detail around him. There are no arrest records or police incidents involving your brother in recent years, Ramirez said, handing Miles a thin file. I also checked unidentified person cases matching his description. Nothing in the main stations. Miles felt his discouragement grow. So we're back to square one. Not exactly, Ramirez said, taking a sip of his coffee. There's one thing. 2 years ago, there was an accident on Main Avenue. A man was hit by a driver who fled the scene. The victim had no ID, and no one came forward to identify him. Miles's heart pounded. What happened to him? He was taken to St. Francis Hospital in critical condition. I couldn't get more information because the police's involvement ended once we filed the initial report. Ramirez paused. But the physical description fits your brother. Miles closed the file and stood up immediately, leaving some cash on the table for the coffees. Thank you, Ramirez. This could be important. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Turner, said the detective. Keep me informed. Missing person cases are always the toughest. Miles walked out of the cafe toward his car, dialing Carl Henderson as he went. Carl, I need you to check something specific. A man with no identification was admitted to St. Francis Hospital 2 years ago after being hit by a car, he explained quickly. I need to know if there's a record of him and what happened. St. Francis isn't part of our network, Carl replied, but I know the administrative director there. I can ask around. Do you have the exact date of the accident? I'll find out and send it to you. Thanks, Carl. As he drove to Grace's apartment, Miles felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. Maybe he'd finally found a real lead. Grace opened the door before he even knocked. From her expression, Miles could tell she'd been waiting for good news. Hello, he said, stepping into the small apartment. How are you two doing? We're okay, Grace replied, closing the door. Sophie's in her room, drawing. She got excited when I said you were coming. Miles nodded, feeling the weight of her expectations. I have some news, but nothing certain yet, he said, keeping his voice low. There's a record of an unidentified man admitted to a hospital 2 years ago after being hit by a car. The physical description matches Jonah. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. Do you think... I don't want to raise false hopes, Miles interrupted. I'm still looking into it. I'll know more tomorrow. Miles, came Sophie's voice from the hallway. She ran into the living room with a bright smile. Did you bring news about my dad? Miles and Grace exchanged a quick glance before he bent down to her level. I'm still searching, Sophie. These things take time. Her smile faded a little. But you will find him, right? I'm doing everything I can, Miles answered, feeling the weight of that implied promise. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied. During the simple dinner Grace prepared, Miles watched the interaction between mother and daughter. How Sophie talked non-stop, telling stories about her day at school, how Grace smiled despite her tired eyes, listening closely to every word her daughter said. They had built a life together, adapting to Jonah's absence. And now he had arrived, stirring up wounds that might have begun to heal. Do you have any recent photos of him? Miles asked as he helped Grace wash dishes after Sophie went to get ready for bed. Grace dried her hands and went to a small chest in the living room, taking out an envelope. "These are the last pictures we took together," she said, handing some photos to Miles. "They were taken a few weeks before he disappeared." Miles examined the images. Jonah was smiling in all of them, hugging Grace or holding Sophie in his arms. He looked happy, at peace. It wasn't the face of a man planning to abandon his family. "Can I keep one of these?" he asked. "It might help with identification." Grace hesitated but nodded. "Take this one," she said, handing over one where Jonah was alone, leaning against a tree in some park. It was one of his favorites. Miles placed the photo carefully in the inside pocket of his jacket, as though it were a fragile treasure. "Thank you. I promise I'll have more information soon." Just as he was about to leave, Sophie appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, holding a small teddy bear. "Will you tell me a story tonight?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Miles looked at Grace, who shrugged with a small smile. "She's been asking that every night since you showed up," Grace explained. "I think she wants to hear stories about her dad." Miles felt a lump in his throat. How could he tell stories about a brother he barely knew anymore, about the last 7 years of Jonah's life? But he couldn't refuse her request. "Just a short story, then," he agreed, following Sophie to her bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the small bed, with Sophie watching him intently, Miles told her how he and Jonah had built a treehouse as kids, how Jonah, even being the younger brother, always had the craziest ideas, how they spent hours up there, imagining all kinds of adventures. Sophie listened with sparkling eyes, absorbing every detail about the father she barely remembered. By the time he finished, she was almost asleep. "I'm going to find your dad, Sophie," Miles whispered, more to himself than to her. "I promise." Leaving the apartment, Miles felt a renewed sense of determination. Tomorrow, he would go to St. Francis Hospital, with or without Carl's help. St. Francis Hospital was located on the outskirts of the city, an old building renovated with a more modern facade. Miles arrived at 9 in the morning, carrying Jonah's photo in his pocket and a rehearsed story about searching for a missing family member. At the reception desk, a clerk looked at him with polite indifference. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for information about a patient who may have been admitted here 2 years ago, a man with no identification, a victim of a hit and run." The woman frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't provide that kind of information without authorization. Privacy policies." Miles was about to insist when a voice behind him spoke. "Mr. Turner." "Miles Turner." He turned to see a middle-aged woman in a white coat. Her name badge identified her as Dr. Helena Vargas, Administrative Director. "That's me," he confirmed, extending his hand. "Do we know each other?" "Carl Henderson called. Said you'd be here," she said, shaking his hand briefly. "Could we talk in my office?" Miles followed the doctor through the hospital corridors, passing crowded wards and bustling staff. The scent of antiseptic was strong. In a small office, Dr. Vargas closed the door and gestured to a chair. "Carl explained your situation. You're looking for your brother." "Yes. And I have reason to believe he may have been brought here 2 years ago after a hit and run." The doctor typed something into her computer, her eyes on the screen. "We did have a case like that, a man with no identification brought in by paramedics after being struck on Main Avenue. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures." She looked at Miles. "He survived, Wasang, but... Miles felt his heart pound. "He never fully regained consciousness. He's been in a persistent vegetative state for 2 years." Miles felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. "Where is he now?" "Here, in our long-term care wing," the doctor replied. "Since no one claimed him and he had no ID, the hospital took on the costs. We have a program for patients like this." "I need to see him," Miles said, standing up. "Right now." Dr. Vargas hesitated but nodded. "I understand. I'll take you there. But I need to warn you, Mr. Turner, if this man really is your brother, you should prepare yourself. Seeing patients in a persistent vegetative state isn't easy." Miles only nodded, unable to speak. They walked in silence to the elevator and down to the 2nd floor. The long-term care wing was a corridor with individual rooms. The sounds were muffled, as though even the air was heavier there. Dr. Vargas stopped at the door of room 217. "He's in here," she said quietly. "I'll leave you alone. I'll be at the end of the hallway if you need anything." Miles thanked her with a gesture and, summoning courage, opened the door. The room was small but clean and bright. A window let in natural light. There was a TV mounted on the wall, turned off, and a single chair by the bed. And on the bed, Miles felt his legs almost give out. Despite the grown-out beard and thinner face, there was no doubt it was Jonah, his younger brother, lying there motionless, connected to monitors and IV lines that beeped steadily. His green eyes, so much like Sophie's, were closed. "Jonah," Miles whispered, approaching slowly. He sat in the chair beside the bed, gazing at the familiar yet unfamiliar face of his brother. The skin was pale, the expression slack. The dark hair was longer than Jonah ever wore it, spread across the pillow. With trembling hands, Miles pulled the photo from his pocket and compared it to the man in the bed. It was undeniably him, the brother who had spent the last 2 years here alone while his family waited in vain. "I found you," Miles said, his voice breaking. "It took me a while, but I found you." He took Jonah's limp hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the faint pulse. His brother was alive, yet absent, trapped somewhere between life and death. The tears came without warning, silently at first, then in sobs Miles couldn't control. Years of guilt, weeks of searching, and now this. Jonah hadn't abandoned his family. He'd been here all along, unable to return, unable to explain. When Dr. Vargas returned, she found Miles still holding his brother's hand, eyes red but with a determined expression. "It's him," Miles confirmed. "He's my brother, Jonah Turner." The doctor nodded, unsurprised. "I'm sorry. I'd like to discuss his condition and treatment options, and we'll need documentation to prove kinship and transfer legal responsibility." "I'll do whatever is necessary," Miles replied. "He's going to get the best care possible, and I need to call his family. They need to know." While Dr. Vargas explained the procedures, Miles looked at Jonah, thinking about Grace and Sophie. How would he tell them? How could he explain Jonah was alive, but might never again be the person he was? In that silent room where time seemed frozen, Miles made another silent promise to his brother. No matter how long it took, no matter the cost, he would bring this family together again. If not in this life, at least in memory. Jonah was no longer lost. He was found, and for now that would have to be enough. Miles's routine changed completely in the weeks that followed. He woke up earlier, stopped by his office only to handle essential tasks, and then headed to the hospital. Afternoons were dedicated to Jonah. What began as an obligation turned into a need. Room 217 now had personal touches. A small radio played music Jonah had liked in their youth. On the walls hung family photos Miles had salvaged from old albums, along with newer pictures of Sophie and Grace. The nurses commented on how the room seemed more alive, even if its occupant remained motionless. "I brought something different today," Miles said on a rainy afternoon, pulling a book out of his briefcase. "Remember this. It was your favorite when we were about 12. It was a worn copy of Treasure Island, its pages yellowed with age. Miles had found it in a box in his parents' attic, among other childhood relics. I'll read some of it to you. Who knows, maybe it'll spark some memory, right?" Miles settled into the chair and started reading out loud. The words flowed, transporting him back to summer afternoons when the two brothers took turns reading, each acting out different characters. That was their daily routine. Miles read, talked, and told stories of work, the weather, the news. Most importantly, he talked about Sophie and Grace. "Sophie's amazing, you know," he remarked, closing the book after a few chapters. "She has your stubbornness, that little frown when she's focused, and your eyes, Jonah, exactly like yours." One of the monitors beeped differently for a moment, and Miles briefly imagined it was a response, but it was only a normal variation in the readings. "Grace is handling this well, considering the circumstances," he continued. "She's strong, stronger than I imagined. She spent 2 years raising Sophie alone, working, making things run." Miles adjusted Jonah's pillow, a gesture he'd learned from the nurses. "She never lost hope that you'd come back. She saved your things. Your photos talked about you to Sophie every day. You chose well, brother. She truly loves you. The visits became a place for Miles to unload all he had never said. Apologies, shared memories, confessions. I should have come after you sooner, he admitted on a particularly tough afternoon. I should have insisted. Maybe if we'd kept in touch, you would have called me that day instead of facing the rain alone. Maybe I could have picked you up, and none of this would have happened. There were no answers, just the steady sound of machines and the occasional footsteps in the corridor. But Miles carried on, day after day, weaving an invisible thread between them. One Wednesday, Miles arrived with something special, a colorful drawing Sophie had made, depicting 3 stick figures, one tall with a tie, obviously Miles, a medium one with long hair, Grace, and a small one in a dress, Sophie. In the corner, a 4th figure lay in a bed. Sophie did this yesterday, Miles said, taping the drawing to the wall beside the bed. She asks about you every day, wants to know when she can see you. Miles studied Jonah's still face, looking for any hint of reaction. I'm thinking of bringing her here. What do you think? He paused, as if truly awaiting an answer. Grace is worried it might be too much for a 5-year-old, but I think Sophie's stronger than we realize. As he left the hospital that afternoon, Miles called Grace. She won't stop asking, Grace said after hearing his suggestion. Every night before bed, she wants to know when she can see her dad. But I'm scared, Miles. What if it's too traumatic for her? I understand your concern, but I think she needs this. She needs to see that he's here, that he didn't choose to leave her. After a long conversation, Grace agreed. The next day, Miles would pick them up after Sophie's school. That night was restless for Miles. He wondered if he was doing the right thing, if he wasn't exposing Sophie to something too heavy for her age. But he remembered her questions, how she always drew her family, including that absent figure. Maybe she needed this moment to understand, just as he had. Right at 3 in the afternoon, Miles pulled up outside Sophie's school. Grace was already there, holding her daughter's hand while Sophie swung her colorful lunchbox, talking animatedly. Are you sure about this? Grace asked quietly when they approached the car. We have to trust her, Miles replied, opening the back door for Sophie. During the drive to the hospital, Sophie fired off questions. She wanted to know if her dad would recognize her, if she could hug him, if he would speak to her. Miles and Grace exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, trying to explain as simply as possible that Jonah was in a special kind of sleep, that he might not be able to answer yet, but would definitely be able to hear her. In the hospital parking lot, Sophie suddenly fell silent. Her excitement gave way to visible nervousness, reflected in how tightly she clung to Grace's hand. It's okay, sweetheart, Grace reassured her, crouching down to look her in the eyes. We can just say hello and leave if you want. You don't have to stay if you feel uncomfortable. Sophie nodded seriously, and they walked inside. The walk to room 217 had never felt so long to Miles. Each step echoed in the quiet hallway. When they reached the door, he turned to Sophie. Remember what we talked about? Your dad is sleeping, and there are some machines helping him stay healthy. It might look scary, but he's just resting. Sophie nodded, holding Grace's hand even tighter. Miles opened the door slowly. The room looked as it always did, gently lit by sunlight through the window, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Jonah lay there, unmoving against the white pillows. Sophie hesitated on the threshold, her wide eyes taking in the scene. Do you want to go in? Grace asked kindly. The girl nodded and took a step inside. Her gaze never left her dad's face. She walked slowly to the bed, still gripping Grace's hand. Hi, Daddy, she said so softly it was nearly a whisper. No one else spoke. The only sounds were the steady beeps of the equipment. Sophie let go of her mother's hand and moved closer until she was right by the bed. Carefully, as though afraid of hurting him, she reached out her small hand and touched Jonah's. The sight of those two hands, her tiny, delicate one on Jonah's larger, motionless one, forced Miles to look away for a moment, his throat constricting with emotion. Sophie stayed like that for a while, just holding his hand, studying his face with surprising intensity for one so young. Her eyes flicked to the tubes, the wires, the monitors. She seemed to be taking it all in, processing it in her own way. After a few minutes, Sophie looked at Miles. "Is he going to wake up?" she asked, her voice small but resolute. Miles swallowed hard. He crouched to her level, looking directly into her eyes so much like Jonah's. "I hope so, Sophie. And I'm doing everything I can to help him come back." She nodded, pondering his answer. Her eyes were dry, but there was a seriousness there, more fitting for an adult than a child. "Can I sit with him?" "Of course," Grace answered, pulling a chair closer to the bed. Sophie sat down and unzipped her backpack, taking out a drawing pad and colored pencils. Casually, as though it was something she did every day, she started to draw. "I'm making a new picture," she explained, focused on the page. "This one will show the three of us together." Miles and Grace watched in silence. The child worked with total concentration, her tongue poking out slightly at the corner of her mouth as she outlined colorful shapes. It was then, watching this unexpected scene, that Miles felt something change inside him. It wasn't just guilt or responsibility driving him now, it was deeper, more complex. Sophie and Grace were no longer simply Jonah's family, people he had to help out of moral obligation. Somehow, in that quiet hospital room, they had become his family too. Miles looked at Jonah's hand, still beneath Sophie's. Despite all the doubts, all the challenges they still faced, a certainty was growing within him. They would get through this together. Him, Grace, Sophie, and in some way, Jonah too. There, in the silence broken only by the soft beeping of machines and the gentle scratching of pencils on paper, Miles realized he was already part of this family, even without knowing how it all began. And instead of frightening him, that realization brought an unexpected peace. The Sunday sun lit up the small backyard of the ground floor apartment Miles had rented for Grace and Sophie. It was a simple place, but airy, with enough outdoor space for Sophie to run around. The move had happened only 2 weeks prior, prompted by convenience. The new address was closer to the hospital, and by the need for a fresh start. Sophie ran across the grass, chasing a yellow butterfly. Her brown hair streamed behind her, and her occasional laughter reached the kitchen, where Miles and Grace sat at the table. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Miles watched through the window, coffee cup in hand, lost in thought. Grace stirred sugar into her cup absent-mindedly, not really drinking. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Over the past few weeks, they'd settled into a rhythm, a shared routine centered on Sophie and hospital visits to Jonah. "She seems happier here," Grace observed, following Miles's gaze to the yard. "I don't know if it's having space to run or if it's because now she knows where her dad is." Miles nodded. "Kids are surprisingly resilient," he replied, setting his mug down. "More so than us adults." Grace gave a small smile, agreeing. Another moment of silence followed, but this time with a question hanging in the air, one Miles had been postponing. "Grace," he began, choosing his words carefully, "there's something I've wanted to ask you about, if you don't mind talking about it." She raised her eyes from her cup, expectant. "How did you and Jonah meet?" The question lingered for a moment. Grace didn't look surprised, as though she had been expecting this. "It was 6 years ago," she said, leaning back in the chair. A small smile tinged with sadness formed on her lips. "I worked in a crafts shop at the old neighborhood fair on weekends. You know that street fair with food stalls and street artists?" Miles nodded, though he'd never actually been there. "Jonah used to play guitar near my stall. He wasn't like the other musicians who passed through quickly, collected a few coins, and left. He stayed in the same spot for hours, playing songs hardly anyone knew." She smiled at the memory. "He didn't seem to care if he earned any money or not. He played as if it was the most natural thing in the world, with no rush." Miles could picture it clearly. Jonah always had that quality, the ability to be fully present in the moment, not worrying about before or after. "We first spoke when I offered him a glass of water on a particularly hot day," Grace continued. "He thanked me like I'd given him something precious. He had that way, you know, making you feel special for small gestures." She paused to sip her now cold coffee. "We started talking every weekend. He helped me set up and take down the stall. Sometimes he brought me a sandwich or coffee. He was kind, funny. seemed out of sync with the hurried world, like he belonged to another time. Miles listened carefully, discovering a version of Jonah he'd never known, or maybe one that had always been there but he'd never truly seen. When we started dating, he moved into my tiny apartment. He didn't have many possessions, just his guitar, some clothes, and books. He got by on temporary jobs and the tips from playing at the fair. Grace looked directly at Miles. He never told me he came from a wealthy family, Miles. Never said he had a brother. He always seemed to be running from a past he didn't want to remember. Miles felt the weight of her words. He imagined Jonah rebuilding his life, creating a new identity without mentioning the old one. Did he talk about his family? Miles asked, trying not to sound too anxious. Grace shook her head. He only said his parents were strict and didn't approve of his lifestyle. That he'd left home very young and preferred not to talk about it, she reflected. Some days, he seemed sad, distant. If I asked what was wrong, he'd say he was just thinking about old things that no longer mattered. Miles lowered his eyes to his cup. It was hard hearing that, for Jonah, the family, and including himself, was part of old things that didn't matter anymore. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared of how he'd react, Grace went on, glancing again at Sophie, now crouched in the grass to observe something. I thought maybe he wouldn't want the responsibility, that it might be too much. But I was wrong. Her face brightened slightly at the memory. Jonah was thrilled. He lit up like he'd finally found something that made complete sense to him. He painted the baby's room, set up the crib, made plans. He played lullabies on his guitar every night so the baby would know his voice, he said. Grace swallowed hard before continuing. When Sophie was born, he was there, holding my hand the entire time, and when they placed her in his arms, her voice caught. I've never seen anyone look at another person with so much love. Miles felt a knot tighten in his throat. This was the part of Jonah's life he'd completely missed, his brother becoming a father, finding his purpose, his place in the world. Those first years were hard financially, but happy, Grace said firmly. Jonah did whatever he could to provide for us. Sometimes he worked 2 or 3 jobs, but he always had time for Sophie. He read stories, played with her, sang. He was the kind of dad every kid deserves. A clear, bell-like laugh drifted in from the yard, where Sophie was now chasing a drifting leaf. Both Miles and Grace glanced to the window simultaneously, smiling at the child's joy. He started getting restless when Sophie turned 3, Grace continued, turning back to the story. He kept saying she deserved more than we could offer with unstable jobs, that we needed a more secure plan. Her face grew serious again. One day, he left saying he was going to find a steady job, said it would be different, that he was tired of making ends meet, and he didn't come back. The words hung in the air of the small kitchen like a cloud. Miles tried to imagine what Jonah had been thinking that day. Had he decided to reach out to the family for help, look for reconciliation, or just try to make it on his own? What did you think when he didn't return? Miles asked softly. Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. At first I was worried. I called the hospitals, his friends, even the police. Then, as days turned into weeks, I started to think maybe he'd decided he didn't want that life anymore, that it was too much for him. She swallowed, clearly fighting back emotion. The hardest part was explaining it to Sophie. How do you tell a 3-year-old her dad left and never returned? I ended up saying he was working far away, that he'd come back as soon as he could. Over time, I realized I was just putting off the inevitable conversation, but I couldn't say the words, take away her hope. Or mine. Miles reached across the table, gently touching Grace's hand in a comforting gesture. She didn't pull away. You were incredible, Grace. Keeping everything going on your own, protecting Sophie, never losing hope. I don't know if I'd have that strength. She gave him a faint smile. I had no choice. Sophie needed me fully present. On bad days, I'd look at her and see Jonah, her eyes, her smile, and it gave me the strength to keep going. Miles nodded in understanding. He watched Grace for a moment, truly seeing her, not just as the woman his brother loved, but as someone extraordinary in resilience and dignity, someone who, despite everything, didn't harbor bitterness, only resigned sadness and unwavering determination. Thank you for telling me this, he finally said, for showing me who Jonah really was to you both. Grace nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Now they shared not only concern for Jonah and care for Sophie, but also a fuller understanding of the man who connected their lives, a man who, for each of them, existed differently but just as truly. In the yard, Sophie finally caught the drifting leaf. She beamed triumphantly, lifting her prize and looking around for the adults so she could share her victory. Miles realized what Jonah had left behind, not just a brother he'd lost touch with, but an entire life built with effort and love. A small, simple home, but one full of meaning. A daughter whose first steps and words he'd witnessed with devotion. And a woman who stayed strong, holding it all together when everything else fell apart. In that moment of realization, Miles silently vowed that no matter what happened to Jonah, he would never abandon this family again. For the first time, he fully understood the weight of the name he shared with his brother, and the responsibility that came with it. Room 217 had become a second office for Miles. The nurses already knew him by name, greeting him with kind smiles when he arrived at the same time each day, always carrying something, a book, fresh flowers, or another photograph for the growing collection on the wall. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Miles entered the room and found a nurse adjusting Jonah's pillow. "How is he today?" Miles asked, placing his briefcase in the usual corner. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Rita, shrugged with a compassionate smile. "Everything's stable, as usual. Vitals are good. His blood pressure's a bit low, but nothing worrisome." Miles nodded, grateful for her care. Rita was one of the nurses most dedicated to Jonah, always talking to him as if he could respond, always gentle in her daily tasks. "Thanks for everything, Rita," she smiled. "I'll be at the station if you need anything," she said, then left quietly. Miles took his seat beside the bed. He pulled out that day's newspaper and started reading the headlines aloud, as he did every day. City news, national news, even the weather forecast. Jonah had always liked staying informed. "That little coffee shop on Lincoln Street is closing," Miles commented, turning the page. "Remember it? We used to go there after school as teenagers. You always ordered that hot chocolate with cinnamon." The silence offered no reply. Miles kept reading, occasionally pausing to connect the articles to shared memories. It was his way of keeping Jonah's identity alive, reminding him who he was, where he came from. When he finished the paper, Miles sat quietly for a moment, simply watching his brother. 2 months had passed since he'd found Jonah in this hospital, and nothing had changed. The doctors avoided predictions. "Every case is unique," they said. "We must remain hopeful but realistic." Miles leaned forward, performing the gesture that had become part of his routine. He took Jonah's hand. The skin was warm, alive, but gave no sign of returning his grip. "You were always the stubborn one in the family," Miles commented, trying to smile. "From the time we were kids, once you set your mind to something, nobody could talk you out of it. Remember when you broke your arm at 9? You climbed that huge tree in the backyard, even though Dad told you not to." The memories flowed more easily now, like a river that had finally found its course after being dammed for years. "I said I was going to tell Dad, and you dared me to do it. When you fell and broke your arm, I thought you'd cry, but no." Miles shook his head, recalling the scene. "You just looked at me with those defiant green eyes and said, 'Now you can tell.' And I didn't. I couldn't." As he spoke, Miles's voice grew choked. Every day, he kept it together, talking to Jonah as if he were just asleep, ready to wake any moment. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the weight of weeks of hope unfulfilled. "I wish you could hear me," Miles said, squeezing Jonah's motionless hand. "I wish we could make things right, Jonah. You have no idea how much I needed that, how much I needed you. And now," his voice broke, "all I want is to see you wake up." The tears he'd held back for so long began to fall freely. He made no attempt to stop them. He let them run down his face as he held his brother's hand, as if hoping to convey everything words couldn't express. "I should have fought harder for you, Jonah. I should have looked for you sooner." Sophie spent 3 years without knowing her uncle. Grace went through everything alone. "I lost you because of my pride, my stubbornness, and now..." Miles didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In the silence of that room, with only the soft hum of monitors for company, he finally let the pain, regret, and fear come to the surface. He cried like he hadn't since he was a child, without shame, without restraint. When his tears subsided, Miles felt strangely lighter. He wiped his face with his shirt sleeve and took a deep breath, pulling himself together. He looked at Jonah once again, noticing how his brother's face appeared calm, almost as if in a deep, restoring sleep. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, standing up, like always. Before leaving, he allowed himself one last long look, filled with a mix of longing and hope. On his way to the parking lot, Miles called Grace. "Hey, Grace, I was wondering, can I drop by and see Sophie tonight?" On the other end of the line, Grace hesitated for a moment. "Sure, she'll love that. We'll be home." Miles began visiting Grace and Sophie almost daily, usually after his hospital visits. At first, Sophie watched him somewhat warily, studying him from a distance. The man in the suit and tie who spoke quietly with her mother was still a mystery to her. Grace never interfered in how their relationship gradually formed. She observed how Miles tried to get closer without pushing, giving Sophie time and space. She saw how Sophie, ever observant, watched his every move as if deciding whether she could trust him. One Wednesday afternoon, Miles arrived with a small gift wrapped in colorful paper. "I brought something for Sophie," he said to Grace, who opened the door looking surprised. "It's nothing big, just a children's book I saw at the bookstore. It's about dinosaurs." "I'm not sure she likes them." Grace smiled. "Why don't you give it to her yourself? She's in the living room." Miles found Sophie sitting on the floor, focused on a drawing. He approached carefully and sat on the sofa, close enough to see, but not so close as to intrude. "Hi, Sophie," he greeted. "Can I see what you're drawing?" She looked up, hesitant, but eventually slid the paper a bit toward him. It showed a big green dinosaur. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Miles asked, pointing to the figure on the page. Sophie nodded with a small smile. "It's a Tyrannosaurus Rex," she said. "They were the strongest one, but they had tiny arms. My teacher said they lived a long time ago, and now only their bones are in museums." It was the longest sentence Miles had heard her speak. He listened to each word like precious music. "I loved dinosaurs when I was your age too," he told her. "Actually, I brought you a present." He held out the wrapped gift, which Sophie took carefully. She opened it slowly, revealing a brightly illustrated dinosaur book with thick pages. "It has all kinds in there," Miles explained, "with pictures and facts about each one." Sophie's eyes lit up as she flipped through the pages. "Thank you," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the book. That was how it started. Over the following weeks, Miles would bring small gifts, a set of colored pencils, a puzzle, more books, nothing fancy or expensive, but always chosen thoughtfully, based on what she seemed to like. He never forced himself on her, merely sat near her, offering help when she needed it, or staying silent while she drew or read. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. Grace watched discreetly. She noticed how Miles, always so formal and composed, would sit on the floor to help Sophie with a puzzle. How he listened intently when Sophie explained a drawing she'd made. How he seemed to relax and smile more around the little girl. One day, just before dinner, Grace walked into the living room and was surprised by what she saw. Sophie showing Miles how to draw a triceratops, guiding his hand on the paper. "No, not like that," Sophie said with the seriousness of a teacher. "The middle horn is smaller. Try again." And Miles, focused as if closing the biggest deal of his life, followed her instructions with total dedication. Gradually, Sophie began to look forward to Miles's visits. She would ask when he was coming, save her drawings to show him, leave puzzles unfinished so they could finish them together. One day, to Miles's surprise, she asked him to play with her in the backyard. On another, she wanted him to read her a bedtime story. Small gestures, but enormous in terms of trust earned. Miles felt a shift within himself. It was more than just worrying about Jonah or feeling responsible for Grace and Sophie. It was a sensation he'd almost forgotten, a tenderness he hadn't experienced in a long time, as if some space inside him, empty for years, was slowly being filled. On a Saturday in October, under a bright blue sky, Miles had an idea. "Grace, would you mind if I took Sophie to the park?" he asked over breakfast. "There's a pond with ducks near my apartment. I thought she might like it." Grace considered it for a moment. "If she wants to go, it's fine by me." Sophie, who'd been listening from the living room, appeared at the kitchen door with shining eyes. "Can I bring Ducky?" she asked, referring to the teddy bear she almost never left at home. Miles smiled. "Of course. I'm sure Ducky will love meeting real ducks." The park was busy that weekend morning, families enjoying the pleasant weather. Miles walked at a leisurely pace, matching Sophie's steps as she skipped beside him, curious about everything around her. Every few yards, she stopped to point out a flower, a colorful leaf, a bug. When they reached the pond, they found a wooden bench partly shaded by an old tree. They sat side by side, watching the ducks paddle lazily in the calm water. "Do they sleep in the water?" Sophie asked, hugging her teddy bear. "Some do," Miles replied. "They can sleep with half their brain at a time, so they stay alert for predators." Sophie's eyes went wide, impressed by the fact. Miles watched her for a moment, this child so small and yet so strong. Summoning courage, he spoke quietly. "Sophie, I wanted to tell you something about me and about your dad." She turned to him, full attention, still clutching her teddy bear tight. "I'm your dad's brother. My name is Miles Turner. We grew up together, but we haven't seen each other for a long time. Life drove us apart." Sophie furrowed her brow, processing the information. "Did you fight with him?" The question, so direct and simple, took Miles by surprise, but he decided to answer just as honestly. "Yes," he said with a sad smile. "But I never stopped loving your dad. And now that I've found you and your mom, I want to do everything I can to take care of you. And most importantly, I want to help your dad get better. I really want to see him wake up." Sophie lowered her eyes, thinking, and ran her fingers absent-mindedly over her teddy's worn ear. Miles didn't rush her, letting her have time to absorb what he'd said. A duck approached the bank, eyeing them hopefully for food. After what felt like a long reflection, Sophie scooted closer on the bench until her small body touched Miles's arm. Then slowly, she leaned her head against it. "I think he'd like knowing you came back," she said softly. Miles felt a surge of emotion so intense that for a moment he worried he couldn't contain it. Carefully, he put an arm around Sophie's shoulders in a gentle hug. "Thank you for saying that," he managed. They stayed like that for a while, watching the ducks, feeling the autumn sun shining through the leaves. Sophie, comfortable, began talking about her school, her friends, and how she was learning to write her full name. Miles listened, answering her questions, laughing at her funny stories. And for the first time since reconnecting with his brother's family, he felt something besides guilt, responsibility, or regret. For the first time, he felt he was rebuilding not only a past, but a future. One where, regardless of what happened with Jonah, there would be space for all of them. Grace, Sophie, and himself. Their family united not by what had been lost, but by what could still be found. Autumn pressed on, coloring the trees in the park near the hospital in shades of red and gold. It had been nearly 5 months since Miles found Jonah. 5 months of daily hospital visits, one-sided conversations and waiting. A routine had developed into something almost comfortable. Office in the morning, hospital in the afternoon, dinner with Grace and Sophie a few times a week. That Thursday, Miles arrived at the hospital carrying a folder of old photos he'd found at his parents' house. Pictures of 2 boys building a snow fort, fishing in a lake, blowing out birthday candles. Memories of a time when the world seemed simple and the future endless. "Good morning, Jonah," he greeted upon entering the room, as he always did. Unlike the early weeks when silence unnerved him, Miles now felt at ease talking to his brother even without response. He had a growing certainty that, on some level, Jonah heard him. "I brought something special today," he said, sitting in the chair by the bed. "Remember that summer camp we went to in Greenwood? You were 10 and scared of the ghost stories the older kids told." Miles opened the folder and began removing photos, describing each one in detail. recounting the stories and moments. It was part of a technique suggested by Dr. Chen, the neurologist overseeing Jonah's case. Familiar stimuli, especially tied to strong emotional memories, can help patients in a minimally conscious state, she had explained. "This one is from your 13th birthday," Miles said, smiling at a picture of Jonah blowing out candles on a chocolate cake. "You asked for a bass guitar as a present, remember? Dad nearly lost it when you started practicing in the basement. He said it wasn't music, it was noise." As he spoke, Miles placed the photos on the bedside table, forming a visual timeline of their shared childhood and adolescence. Softly, a playlist Sophie had helped create played on the radio. Music Jonah liked, according to Grace. "Sophie is learning to play the flute at school," Miles remarked, adjusting Jonah's pillow, another automatic gesture. "She practices every day. Grace says it's torture, but she laughs when she says it. I'm sure you'd be proud." It was at that moment, while straightening the sheet over Jonah's still form, that Miles noticed something. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Jonah's right index finger twitched. Miles froze, watching intently. It could have been a simple reflex, something that had happened before. The doctors had explained that involuntary movements were common in vegetative or minimally conscious states, but something felt different this time. "Jonah," he called, moving closer. "Can you hear me? If you can hear me, try moving your finger again." Silence. Only the steady hum of the monitors and the soft background music. Miles tried to rein in the wave of hope surging inside him. How many times had he imagined seeing signs of improvement that turned out to be nothing more than his own wishful thinking? He was about to give up when it happened again. The finger moved, with a bit more force this time, as though Jonah was trying to reach out. "Oh my God," Miles whispered, pressing the nurse call button. "Jonah, I'm here. Keep trying, brother." Rita, the nurse, appeared at the door. "Is everything all right, Mr. Turner?" "His finger, it moved." "Twice," Miles explained, voice trembling with emotion. "It wasn't just a reflex, Rita. It was different." The nurse approached professionally, though cautious. She'd seen family members get overly hopeful many times. She checked Jonah's vital signs, performed some stimulation tests, and observed closely. "I'll call Dr. Chen," she finally said, with a small smile she couldn't fully hide. "It looks like there might be a change in his response pattern." As Rita left to get the doctor, Miles held Jonah's hand firmly. "I knew it," he said softly. "I knew you'd come back." Time seemed to crawl until Dr. Chen arrived. Miles stayed by the bed, talking non-stop, showing Jonah the photos, encouraging any reaction. Twice more, Jonah moved his fingers. Then something else happened that nearly stopped Miles's heart. A sound, not a word, just a soft murmur, almost inaudible, but definitely coming from Jonah. When the neurologist finally walked in, Miles was practically buzzing with anticipation. "He moved, doctor, and he made a sound, I'm sure of it." Dr. Chen, a middle-aged woman with keen eyes behind thin-framed glasses, approached the bed. Her expression was calm and professional as she examined Jonah methodically, checking his pupillary responses and reactions to verbal and tactile stimuli. "Mr. Turner, how long ago did you notice these changes?" "About 20 minutes, Miles replied, watching her every move. "First his finger, then he tried to say something, I'm sure of it." The doctor made some notes on Jonah's chart, then turned to Miles. "There are some signs of increased neurological activity," she said carefully. "His pupillary reflexes are more responsive, and there are indications of voluntary movement, not just a reflex." Miles felt a wave of hope so strong he had to steady himself on the bed rail. "Does that mean he's waking up?" Dr. Chen took off her glasses, a gesture Miles recognized. She always did it before giving important news. "What we're seeing suggests your brother may be transitioning from a vegetative state to a minimally conscious state," she explained. "It's significant progress, but you need to understand that we're still far from a full recovery." "But it's a good sign, right?" "Yes, Mr. Turner, it is a good sign. We'll increase the frequency of cognitive tests and start a new stimulation protocol." Miles could barely contain his emotions. After months of uncertainty, here was something concrete, beyond his stubborn hope. "May I call Grace?" She'll want to know. The doctor nodded. Of course, but remember, we must be cautious with our expectations. Recovery from brain injury is a slow and unpredictable process. Even with the doctor's cautionary tone, Miles felt a certainty building inside. Jonah was coming back. Maybe not completely. Maybe not as before. But he was coming back. After Dr. Chen left, Miles immediately called Grace. "He moved! Grace!" he blurted as soon as she answered, without even greeting her. He made a sound. The doctor confirmed there's increased brain activity. On the other end, he heard her shaky breathing. "Are you sure?" Grace's voice was almost a whisper. "Positive. Dr. Chen said he might be emerging from the vegetative state. Grace, he's coming back." Miles heard the sound of her stifled sob. "I'm on my way," she finally said. "Please, can you have someone pick up Sophie from school?" "Of course, I'll arrange everything. Just come." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind. Miles arranged for a driver to pick up Sophie and drop her off with a trusted neighbor. Grace arrived at the hospital with red eyes and trembling hands. Together, they waited by Jonah's side, watching every slight movement, every change in the monitors. Dr. Chen returned in the late afternoon with a bigger team, a physical therapist, a speech therapist, and another neurologist. They performed a battery of tests while Miles and Grace observed from a distance, holding hands without realizing it, united by anxiety and hope. "We'll adjust his medication and start a more intensive stimulation program," Dr. Chen explained after finishing her evaluations. "The next few days will be crucial." Night had fallen by the time the medical team finally left, leaving Miles and Grace alone with Jonah. The room was silent except for the familiar beeping of the monitors. "Do you think he knows we're here?" Grace asked, sitting beside the bed holding Jonah's hand. "I'm sure of it," Miles replied. "He's always known." They stayed like that for a while, each lost in their thoughts, until Grace decided to go home to be with Sophie. "I'll stay here tonight," Miles said, "just in case something happens." Grace nodded. "Call any time, no matter what." After Grace left, Miles settled into the recliner the hospital staff had provided. The lights were dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the monitors. He was exhausted but too keyed up to sleep. He continued talking to Jonah, off and on, recounting the day's events, the tests, Grace's arrival. It was just after midnight when it happened. Miles was dozing lightly when a more pronounced movement made him sit up. Jonah had turned his head slightly toward him. Then, the eyes that had remained closed for so long began to open. Miles jumped up, moving closer to the bed. "Jonah?" Jonah's eyelids fluttered, then opened completely. His gaze was unfocused, confused, but undeniably aware. "Jonah, it's me." "Miles, you're awake." Miles's voice broke with emotion. For a terrifying moment, Miles feared Jonah wouldn't recognize him, that the brain damage was worse than they'd hoped. But then, slowly, Jonah's eyes seemed to focus. He blinked several times, as if trying to adjust, and scanned the unfamiliar room, the equipment, the white walls. At last, his gaze landed on Miles. "Miles," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes," Miles confirmed, gripping his brother's hand tightly. "I've been here since I found you. I never left your side." Jonah appeared to process the information slowly. His face, blank for so long, now showed confusion, recognition, and finally emotion. He looked away, visibly struggling to keep himself together. "I thought you'd never want to see me again," he finally managed, each word an effort. Miles shook his head, tears streaming freely down his face now. "I should have come for you sooner. I regret everything, Jonah. The fight, the silence, the distance," he said, voice trembling. "But I'm here now, and I want you to know, I never stopped being your brother. I never stopped caring." Jonah closed his eyes for a moment. When he reopened them, tears trailed silently down his cheeks. "We still have time, right?" The simple, direct question carried all the weight of their lost years, the words left unsaid, the lives that took separate paths only to converge at the most improbable moment. "We have all the time you need," Miles answered, squeezing his brother's hand. No further words were necessary. Not then. The silence that once represented distance and loss was now filled with mutual understanding, a reunion that went beyond the physical. They stayed like that side by side, in shared silence, teary eyes reflecting everything that had been said and everything still to be lived. The road ahead would be long and undoubtedly difficult, but for the first time in a very long time, there was more than hope. There was certainty. Jonah had come back, and this time, Miles wouldn't let him go. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window blinds, creating golden stripes across the room. 3 days had passed since Jonah woke up. 3 days of medical tests, evaluations, and small victories. His arms were gradually regaining strength. His speech, initially hesitant, grew clearer with each hour. The doctors spoke of a remarkable recovery, while also warning of the long road still ahead. Miles waited in the hallway, checking the time every few minutes. Today was the day. Sophie would finally see her dad awake. Grace had prepared her as best as possible, explaining that he looked different, thinner, weaker, but he was still the same dad she knew from photos, the same one who loved her more than anything. When the elevator doors slid open and Grace appeared, holding Sophie's hand, Miles felt a tightness in his chest. The little girl wore a blue dress, the shade Jonah once said was his favorite, and clutched a colorful envelope. Her face revealed a mix of anxiety and anticipation that was almost painful to witness. "You're here," Miles said, crouching down to meet Sophie's eye level. "Your dad is really excited to see you." Sophie nodded, looking too serious for a 5-year-old. "Is he really better?" she asked in a small voice. "He is," Miles reassured her. "Still weak, but awake and talking. He really wants to see you." Grace kneeled beside her daughter, tucking a stray lock of hair behind Sophie's ear. "Remember what we talked about. Daddy still needs to stay in the hospital for a while, but now we can visit him and talk to him." Sophie nodded again, gripping the envelope tighter. "Can I give him my drawing?" "Of course," Miles said, smiling. "He'll love it." They walked slowly down the corridor, Grace and Miles exchanging anxious looks over Sophie's head. There was no way to predict how this meeting would go. How Jonah would react to seeing a daughter who'd grown so much in his absence. How Sophie would deal with this fragile version of the father she barely remembered. At the door to room 217, Miles paused. "I'll go in first, okay?" "Just to let him know you're here," Grace agreed, and Miles slipped inside, leaving the door partially ajar. Jonah was sitting up more than before, propped up on pillows. Someone, likely one of the nurses, had helped groom him, and his beard was trimmed. He looked nervous, fingers drumming lightly on the bedspread. "They're here," Miles said softly. Jonah took a deep, shaky breath. "How is she?" he asked, his voice still a bit rough. "She's anxious. Happy? A little scared, maybe," Miles replied honestly. "But mainly, she's here, ready to see you." Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, like he was summoning strength, then nodded. "I'm ready." Miles went back to the door and gestured gently. Grace entered first, her face a mixture of joy and apprehension. Sophie followed, holding her mother's hand, her steps small and hesitant. She stopped abruptly when she saw Jonah in the bed, her eyes wide. The room fell completely silent. Jonah stared at his daughter as if witnessing a miracle. His already teary eyes drank in every detail. The longer hair, the less rounded cheeks, the taller frame. The little girl he'd left at 3 was now 5, and that 2-year gap must have felt like a universe of difference. "She's so big," Jonah whispered, choked with emotion, voice cracking. How long was I like this?" Miles, standing by the bed, placed a gentle hand on his brother's shoulder. 2 years, he said quietly. The impact of those words showed on Jonah's face. 2 years, 730 days lost. First day of school, birthdays, Christmases, baby teeth falling out. New words learned, fears overcome. Jonah brought his hand to his face, as if trying to hide the overwhelming emotion. "I missed 2 years of her life," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, the pain etched into each syllable. Sophie, who had been watching with the cautious stillness of a child in unfamiliar territory, released Grace's hand. Slowly, Deliberately, she approached the bed. Miles and Grace held their breath, letting the moment unfold on its own. When she got close enough, Sophie reached out, her small fingers carefully touching the hand Jonah had resting on the blanket. "But you woke up," she said, with the simple wisdom children often have. "And I waited. We drew pictures of you sleeping a bunch of times." Something broke inside Jonah at that moment. The tears he'd managed to hold back streamed freely down his face. He tried to smile, to voice the words his heart was screaming, but the emotion was too overwhelming. All he could do was extend his trembling arms toward his daughter. Sophie glanced at her mother, as if asking for permission. With a gentle nod from Grace, she moved closer, allowing Jonah to wrap her in a cautious embrace. She didn't hug him back immediately, still processing, but she didn't pull away. Miles averted his gaze, feeling tears sting his own eyes. He wiped them discreetly, giving father and daughter the moment that was rightfully theirs. "Look what I made for you," Sophie said after a while, pulling back gently and offering him the colorful envelope. With shaking hands, Jonah opened it, revealing a drawing done in bright crayons. It showed 4 figures, a woman, a man in a tie, a small girl, and a man in a hospital bed, all holding hands, all smiling. "That's our family," Sophie explained, pointing to each figure. "That's you, that's Mommy, that's Uncle Miles, and that's me." Jonah's fingers moved gently over the drawing, too choked up to speak. The lump in his throat was massive. The impact of those simple words, "our family," almost too big to bear. Grace drew closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. She took Jonah's free hand, her eyes reflecting emotions that words couldn't convey. "She asked about you every single day," Grace said softly. "We never truly let you go." Time seemed suspended, as though the outside world paused so this moment could unfold at its own pace. Sophie, with a child's natural resilience, began talking about school, friends, her favorite games. Jonah listened to every word as a gift, a glimpse into the years he'd lost. Eventually, Sophie began to look tired, and Grace suggested they come back later. The little girl agreed but insisted on giving her dad a kiss on the cheek, promising to bring more drawings tomorrow. After Grace and Sophie left, a different kind of silence filled the room. Miles, who had lingered discreetly in the background during the family reunion, came closer to the bed. "You have an amazing daughter," he said, sitting in the chair next to Jonah. "She's perfect," Jonah replied, voice still thick with emotion. "And I missed so much." "But you've gained a lot, too," Miles reminded him. "She waited for you. We all did." Jonah turned to look at his brother, really look at him, for the first time since waking up. "Why did you do all of this, Miles? After everything, after our fight, after I walked away?" "Because you're my brother," Miles answered simply. "And because I was wrong." There was no accusation in his words, no bitterness, just a straightforward truth, free of pride or pretense. "We both were," Jonah admitted, shifting his gaze toward the window where late afternoon sunlight was beginning to glow orange. "I should have explained better. I should have stayed in touch, at least. And I should have tried to understand, instead of judging," Miles continued. "But that's in the past now. What matters is what we do going forward." They fell silent for a moment, each absorbing the weight of those simple but profound words. There was no tally of grievances, no list of who hurt whom more. Just mutual acknowledgement of mistakes made, time lost, feelings that had survived in spite of everything. "I'm going to get better, Miles," Jonah finally said, a new determination in his eyes. "I'm going to leave this hospital. I'm going to be the father Sophie deserves." Miles smiled, squeezing his brother's shoulder lightly. "I know you will, and I'll be here every step of the way." Forgiveness hung in the air, unspoken but present. It was in the look they exchanged, in the silent pledge not to waste another day of what could still be lived. The journey would be long, but now a clear path lay before them, one they would travel as a family at last. Outside, the sun was setting, bathing the room in golden light. In Sophie's drawing, which Jonah now held to his chest, 4 stick figures smiled, linked by simple lines representing their joined hands, a humble image of everything that mattered. of everything that had survived despite loss and time. Spring brought more than sunny days. It brought Jonah home. 6 months after awakening from the coma, he finally walked out of the hospital, leaning on a cane and on Miles's shoulder. His body was still weak, his coordination impaired, but his eyes shone with renewed determination. Recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy 3 times a week, speech therapy twice. Appointments with neurologists, occupational therapists, and psychologists filled the calendar Miles meticulously organized. Every small achievement was celebrated, holding a cup without spilling, climbing a single step unaided, speaking an entire sentence without stumbling. "I never thought it'd be this hard to relearn how to live," Jonah remarked one afternoon, frustrated after a grueling session. "But you are relearning," Miles replied, sitting next to him. "That's what counts." While Jonah fought to regain his skills, Miles worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Grace's old apartment was too small and lacked accessibility. Despite her initial resistance, he found a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood with a garden, wide rooms, and an adapted suite on the ground floor. "I can't accept this," Grace protested when Miles showed her the property photos. "It's not a gift, it's an investment in our family," he replied, surprising even himself with how natural the word "our" felt. "Sophie needs space to grow. Jonah needs a place that supports his recovery, and you deserve some peace after everything." The move happened gradually. First the essential furniture, then Sophie's belongings, and finally carefully chosen memorabilia, photos, books. The guitar Jonah hadn't touched in years, but that Miles insisted on retrieving from the old place. Miles didn't officially move in, but he had his own bedroom in the house. "For emergencies," he said, though he spent more nights there than in his downtown apartment. Nobody questioned his constant presence. He had become indispensable, not just for practical matters, but emotionally as well. For Grace, he was a safe harbor on nights when the reality of the situation overwhelmed her. For Sophie, he was a companion for stories and adventures. For Jonah, he was the brother who had come back, the bridge to a past slowly being reintegrated into the present. A routine emerged. Grace returned to part-time work. Miles juggled his corporate responsibilities with his family role. Jonah focused on healing and, above all, on reconnecting with Sophie. "She's grown so much," Jonah said one night after putting his daughter to bed. "Sometimes I look at her and don't recognize the gestures she has now, the ones she didn't have before." "But she recognizes you," Miles replied. "That's what matters." Of course, there were tough days. Days when Jonah's frustration over his limitations turned into sharp words. Days when Grace withdrew, weighed down by the changes. Days when Miles questioned his place in this new family dynamic, especially as he watched Jonah and Sophie's bond grow stronger. But there were far more good days. Shared dinners filled with laughter instead of silence. Sunday afternoons in the garden, while Sophie ran freely through grass she'd never had before. Quiet late-night conversations on the porch, once the child was asleep and the adults could finally exhale. Summer arrived, bringing more progress. Jonah took his first steps without the cane. His speech, once halting, flowed more naturally. Some effects of his injuries might be permanent, the doctors warned, but the quality of life he had regained was already more than anyone dared hope for. On a particularly beautiful Sunday, the family decided on a backyard picnic. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue. Jonah sat under an apple tree, watching the activity around him. Miles arrived carrying a basket of food Grace had prepared. Sophie dashed barefoot through the grass, chasing a butterfly. In that moment of perfect tranquility, Sophie suddenly abandoned her chase and ran toward Miles. Without warning, she hugged him from behind, almost knocking the basket out of his hands. "Uncle Miles," she said, as naturally as if she'd always called him that. Miles froze. In all the months since he met Sophie on the sidewalk, she had never called him that. It was always Miles, plain and simple. He turned slowly, eyes brimming with emotion. Sophie smiled, unaware of how deeply her choice of words affected him. To her, it was just the obvious name for her dad's brother, someone who was part of her family. Miles knelt down to hug her back. The word uncle felt like an unexpected gift, a silent acknowledgement of everything he'd been striving to be. Someone reliable, present, a permanent part of her life. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked, noticing the emotion in his eyes. "Nothing," Miles answered with a smile. "I'm just really happy to be here with you." From a short distance away, Grace watched with a gentle smile on her lips. Next to her, seated under the tree, Jonah observed in silence. There was a time he might have felt threatened or jealous, but now there was only gratitude. He gave a small nod, an almost imperceptible gesture that carried decades of unspoken history between brothers. That summer marked the start of a new chapter. The past was still present, in the physical and emotional scars they all bore, but there was finally space for the future to blossom. On the main wall of the living room, Miles helped Jonah hang 2 pictures. The first was the old photo Sophie had shown him on that first day. The second was a recent one of the 4 of them together in the garden, side by side. They were a portrait of what had been lost and what had been found. A visual reminder that, even after the longest silences, there is always a way back. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.